So I thought we'd start off just talking about your time at the division, and one of the things that you'd overseen was this huge restructuring of enforcement. How did that go, and how does that set up the agency for the future?
I think, Emily, it sets up the agency and the division particularly well. The seeds of the restructuring were planted, I think, in the wake of the Madoff crisis and the financial crisis. And I think the result of those two things combined to make it a prime opportunity for the Commission and the division to sort of reassess how it conducted its enforcement mission. I was fortunate enough to come from not just the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, where I'd run the frauds unit, but even more valuable for these purposes was my 7 years at Deutsche Bank. I sort of took the job thinking it would be my role as a former prosecutor that would be most valuable, but it really turned out to be, for the first couple of years, my time in-house, because there were some fundamental changes that could be made, I think, that really sharpened the mission's focus. So we created specialized units across the country. The division had always been set up regionally, so whoever ran the San Francisco SEC office handled all matters within that region, whether it be insider trading or accounting fraud or market manipulation, whatever it might be. But we set up specialty units in asset management, which covered private funds and mutual funds and private equity, market abuse covering insider trading and high-frequency trading, algo trading, and other market abuses, FCPA, structured products, dealing with mortgage, primarily mortgage and mortgage-related products, CDOs, et cetera, and munis. And we set up these national units, so you could have a staff member in one of the units in California, and the head of the unit in Philadelphia, and the deputy in Boston. But it was really these national units which had sort of increased training. We hired private sector experts from Wall Street and elsewhere to come in and help us, intense training, and just doing the same kind of cases over and over again so that they understood the products and the markets and the transactions better. Something that at Deutsche Bank, I understood all too well, because these are highly complex markets and transactions. You needed that kind of expertise. So specialized units were important. We eliminated a layer of management, another concept from the private sector. When I came in, I asked the sort of simple question of what's the manager to staff ratio here? Took a little while to get those numbers, but they came back pretty startling, about 3.25 staff for every one manager, a ratio that reflects a pretty top-heavy organization. Not for any, it didn't develop that way because of improper motive. What do you do in the government when you can't pay more money to your high performers? Which you can't really do in the government. You give them a title and you give them some people to manage. So you had a layer of manage of highly talented people, but those kind of ratios just stifled innovation and accountability, and just created too much process and bureaucracy. So we cut out 113 branch chiefs and rededicated them back to the front lines of conducting investigations. And we brought a COO in, from the private sector. You quickly realize that it's the COO that, in many cases, is the most important person in the organization. They make the trains run on time. And so we brought in a COO from Goldman who, handled HR and workflow and project management and budget and all the stuff that lawyers were sort of struggling with and doing the best they could, but it's just not their core competency. So we did that. So a number of those things, I think, position the division well in the future to just have a sharp, informed focus, people working on their core competencies and better able to fulfill the enforcement mission.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting since we're sort of on the eve of another possible restructuring or shift in the agency with, Mary Jo White had a pretty decent confirmation hearing the other week, and we're sort of waiting any day for her confirmation. I know you worked with her in New York for many years. What do you think her stamp will be on enforcement in the sort of new unit that you guys set up, a new way of operating?
Well, like so many things, what's going to drive the new chairman's priorities is going to be, to some degree, the circumstances that she's presented with. And in this case, even though she comes from an enforcement background, as she said, I think it's really going to be the Dodd-Frank rulemaking side that's going to be her primary priority at least in the early months and years. There's a great backlog of Dodd-Frank rulemaking to be done. The Jobs Act as well, which is a significant issue, in determining how best to regulate, the new crowdfunding rules, how to deal with the fact that general solicitations will now be permitted for certain capital raising, and what that means for enforcement, because for many years general solicitations were prohibited on the theory that you don't want to be offering privately placed securities to anything but accredited investors, and those rules have now been liberalized. The research rules have been liberalized, all with an eye toward easing the ability for companies to raise capital, which is a laudable goal, but there's obviously a tension there between that and preventing fraud and misconduct. So, those rules have got the attention of Congress, particularly in the House side, where they want those rules done. And then there's a lot of rulemaking around derivatives and other Dodd-Frank rules. So I think that's going to get her attention. I think she'll do a great job. She will jealously guard the independence of the agency. She's an independent thinker and doesn't like to be told what to do. That's very important for the SEC's mission to keep independent. She will attract a great deal of talent, I think, to the commission. She has quite a following. People will want to work for her and want to work for the agency. So I think it all bodes well for the future of the commission.
Does the rulemaking put a lot of pressure on enforcement in terms of getting priority and attention from commissioners, or?
No, the enforcement machine tends to roll along and also tends to, there's less philosophical clash in the enforcement side than there is on the rulemaking side, right? I mean, kind of most people are against fraud, no matter where you are in the on the political spectrum, or if you're not against it, at least you're not likely to publicly defend it. Most of the cases out of enforcement are not controversial. Certainly there are some that are very significantly controversial, but a large number of them, particularly where you have, what amounts to just out and out misrepresentation. There's not a huge philosophical clash about that, as opposed to the rulemaking side, where, in good faith, the commissioners may well have different views on where to draw some of these lines on issues like derivative regulation or the Jobs Act, or et cetera. So I think the fact that that's going to be a priority for the commission won't undermine or impair the enforcement mission. The bigger issues for enforcement have to do things like, as the cases from the financial crisis roll off, we created a specialized unit. We brought a record number of cases arising out of the financial crisis, over 150, with probably 60, 70 CEOs, CFOs, other high-ranking corporate officers charged. Those cases will roll off over time, and the question is, what will be the SEC's and the enforcement division's focus and priority in the months and years ahead?
Yeah, speaking of all the rulemaking, one of the interesting things over the past few years was this Office of the Whistleblower that came out of the new rules and the SEC's focus on whistleblowers. And I know that's a big deal for this audience, and corporations have been very focused on whistleblowers. Elise Walter was speaking the other night at George Washington University, and she was saying that they've only paid one whistleblower award so far, but there's 142 cases, she said, that sort of involve or could be eligible for whistleblower awards. So from your seat at enforcement, how was the Office of the Whistleblower working? How were corporate whistleblowers coming to you?
The SEC was presented with a pretty clear statute from Congress as to how this the whistleblower program was to work. And I think everyone in the commission recognizes the balance here. On the one hand, whistleblowers are highly valuable sources of information, particularly because they can identify fraud and wrongdoing earlier on in the process, before so much investor loss has occurred. They can identify who's responsible in certain kinds of misconduct and wrongdoing where the perpetrators are sophisticated and cover their tracks well and aren't really difficult to gather evidence on their role, particularly those that are high up in a scheme. And so they're very valuable sources of information, and one only need to look at the number of corporate schemes or wrongdoing that have gone on for months or even years without detection, where at least theoretically a whistleblower would have been able to expose that wrongdoing sooner. On the other hand, we all recognize that that whistleblowers often can be a mixed bag. It's a system that can sometimes lead to potential abuse. When I was referring again back to my days at Deutsche Bank, I would remember that every February or March when bonuses were announced and promotions were announced, there'd be a huge spike in whistleblower complaints. Not surprisingly, folks who were unhappy with their compensation or their promotions all of a sudden would become whistleblowers, in part to try and achieve through that means what they couldn't achieve through their own performance. And whistleblowers can sometimes tend to be, just as in terms of their characters, can be a complicated lot. So how do you balance those two things? And then the Commission did a very good job in the rules in doing that, particularly with the question of internal compliance and controls for companies. So, we didn't mandate, as I think many in the industry wanted, including the Business Roundtable and others in the Chamber, wanted to mandate whistleblowers have to first go in-house and bring their complaints in-house before being able to go to the Commission. That was a view I think that was at odds with the statute, so I don't think the Commission even had the authority to do that because the statute was pretty clear. But what we did do is say, look, the whistleblower can choose to either go to the Commission first or go in-house first. We thought that the whistleblower was in the best position to know which he or she thought would be the most effective first step. But we did a lot of things to make sure to sort of make sure that there were incentives for the whistleblower to go in-house first, because we recognize the important role that in-house lawyers and compliance personnel and other risk personnel play, and the obligation they have as fiduciaries to weed out wrongdoing in their own company. So we did a couple of things. We said that a whistleblower who went in-house first would not lose their place in line. So if they went in-house first and then 100 days later went to the SEC, they would be viewed as having gone to the SEC as of the date they went in-house. So they wouldn't lose their place in line, and somebody wouldn't jump ahead of them with the same information and reap the reward, and they would therefore be penalized for going in-house. We added as a positive factor in calculating the amount of the award, whether or not they went in-house first, and as a negative factor if they did not. So in the Commission's discretion in deciding how much to award a whistleblower, if they otherwise met all of the criteria, they could get an increased amount for going in-house and would get a decreased amount if they did not. And lastly, we said that if a whistleblower went in-house first and then the company conducted an internal investigation and brought that to the SEC and it resulted in a case, the whistleblower would be credited not just with the small piece of the case that they might have been aware of that they brought in-house, but they'd be credited with the entirety of the investigation that resulted from that. And so it encourages whistleblowers who maybe only have a small piece of the wrongdoing or a scheme, which by itself may not qualify award, but if they go in-house, an investigation is conducted and that's brought to the Commission and a case is made, that whistleblower benefits from the entire fruits of the investigation, which translates into an award for them. So that's a further incentive for them to go in-house. And maybe my view is skewed, but what I heard from the industry in the months and years since the passage of the Act is that's a pretty good balance, and it's working fairly well. It's not to say that there aren't real issues, including the anti-retaliation issues and others that are out there, but all in all, I think the program's working pretty well.